So this is about the sustainable tourism, where we talk about the livelihood and the economies that involved both Bangladesh and India, because Sundarban is a huge expanse uh, of the rainforest, uh, uh, which falls between India and Bangladesh. They share the boundary, and I tell you about 60% of this landmass is with Bangladesh, remaining 40% which is India. And it has a huge expanse of biodiversity of flora and fauna. And but what really bothers us is a very fragile ecosystem. And these fragile ecosystems really make us think that how long this Sundarban is going to survive. There are some very alarming and kind of a doomsday predictions about this Sundarban, which I will go into the subsequent style of explaining. But what I'm trying to deal with is that if Sundarban has to be a sustainable tourism project, at the same time where country like India and Bangladesh still dealing with the poverty at a very large scale. So how these will be able to interact with each other, this sustainable tourism and the poverty alleviations programs of this country. With tourism, we know that it's a it has a multiple effect on the economy. It is listed in one of the 16 high growth sector. It certainly is bogged up for poverty eradications. So if you go to this slide of to have a very brief overview of what Sundarban is, and it talks about primarily that it is a huge landmass. So that's something that we know. This landmass talks about it is being enlisted as a World Heritage Site, and it is primarily situated in a delta that is formed, which is at the meeting point of the Ganges and Brahmaputra, which is one of the mightiest river. And there's another called Meghna River, the Bay of Bengal. So this entire expanse is covered with mangrove forest. And this mangrove forest is our defense mechanism, is a bulwark against the cyclone. And it also saves the entire forest from disappearing. It protects the fragile ecosystem of the island. Okay, now what also is an important part of this is that the people that who are dependent on this landmass, on this huge landmass, is quite a large numbers. Directly about some 2.5 million inhabitants in this Sundarbans. Now, if you can go to the next slide, which is primarily going to talk about the that how it really creates a kind of a protective shield, this huge landmass, and if you see this, it saves us primarily from the soil erosions, from the disappearance, and also it creates a livelihood for these 2.5 million people that I mentioned. And then they all thrive on this very diverse flora and fauna, which consists of about 300 species of the birds. There are mammals, there are reptiles, there are over 100 types of the fishes. So this seems to be quite a bit to deal with. The next slide is about our big concern, which is where I talk about the doomsday preacher would say that this entire Sundarban probably will not be there. And one of the prediction is that by 2050, the sea level would rise and we lose a huge landmass from this low-lying delta region. And this already has failed. If you see our history or the earliest recorded history of Sundarban in 1770, and we are in 2021 today, the landmass was something like 36,000 square kilometer. Now it is reduced to something like 25,000 square kilometers. So that definitely is a big concern. But even the bigger concern is that in the next few decades, it's going to disappear very fast. Okay. So one of the things that we now think about is that how do you protect this? Primarily, the threat is from the greenhouse gas emissions from very hostile form of tourism, and in the name of the development and poverty eradications, we have exploited this huge uh, uh, reserve of land mass and the flora and fauna. So now, if you can go to the next slide, which talks about, I primarily looking through, scouring through a lot of literature. These two literature which really captured my attention is one is of the Spenceley, Mayers, and the other one is Baird. And primarily these two literatures, one is where the Spenceley and Mayer talking about on two themes. Our entire things must be discussed, entire discourse must be based on. One is community-based tourism projects, which probably would also talk about deliberate on the structural conditions. And the second part is the power relations between the various global actors and the local communities. So here, that is something I probably would extend that discourse to link it to the social network theory, the way that an individual actually operates in a group situations. So how the group dynamics emerge in a, case something like sociogram, which is a kind of a metric that we apply to quantify that relationship. But those kind of things probably can be brought into this discourse of the Spenceley and Mayer. And the second part is the Eric Baird, and where the primary focus is that Sundarban populations can be formed into four distinct social groups. So one is the current visitors who are the footfalls. The second is the future visitors. Third is the present of the host community. And the fourth part is the future host community. So this is something that I wanted to underscore under the literature review. The other part is that the methodology. Okay, in the methodology, we do have where the focus primarily is that where we would be able to take into account of not only the environment, but also the society and the economy at large. Because you cannot operate in a silo mode only talking about environment. That environment comes with its own baggage of society and economy, and each would have its own demand on the way the Sundarban needs to be maintained as a sustainable tourism project. So, so all these things need to be come into the tourism planning. One of these important things that I would like to underscore is the Liu's recommendations, and that primarily talks about the 6 principal issues that which relates to tourism demand, the very nature of the tourism resources, and the imperative of the intra-generational equity. And the fourth one is, of course, the role of tourism in promoting sociocultural progress. Fifth is the measurement of sustainability and also the forms of sustainable development. So this is something that I think has been a part of this methodology. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, that it has to be a very, not only an interdisciplinary approach, which I picked up from Liu's recommendations of this on the 6 principal issues, but also it has to be a cross-disciplinary approach. So sustainable tourism discussions, whether we are talking about principles, policy prescriptions, or the management methods, all need to have need to be oriented towards an interdisciplinary approach and cross-disciplinary approach. Okay, so that's something would be able to make a Sundarban more sustainable, and rather than putting it under a kind of very rigid framework, it has to be a very adaptive framework, a paradigm which can legitimize the various approaches according to specific circumstances. Okay, now, if you talk about, I mentioned about our primary dilemma is that which one would you choose? Would you choose poverty reductions, or would you choose protecting the natural habitat? You see, so that dualism, we simply have to see that how we would be able to have various trade-offs, various conflicts. All this can be resolved under a discourse which we say that okay, it's tourism and poverty reductions, but how much is how far do we go in terms of setting our goals under sustainable tourism? At the same time, poverty reductions should not override these sustainable tourism goals. I think there need to be some kind of a trade-off. So we discussed that in this under this tourism and poverty reductions. And the second part is the various social and environmental impacts, where we try to garner all these multiple responses from all the stakeholders in these Sundarbans. And from there, we say that the indicators from this point of view of Sundarban sustainable tourism need to be reviewed. And hence, we have we have identified 5 categories, which includes the population's peace, prosperity, pollutions, and protections. Now, the other thing is the role of tourism in expansion of these protected areas. So it's not about Sundarban as a whole, but how do you have zoned up certain areas which are more vulnerable than the other areas? And how, when you promote tourism, how do you promote this tourism? How do you regulate the footfall of the tourism? And then finally, I would also like to mention that there is a Bangladesh national tourism policy, and India also has its own policy. And this policy also provides a guideline that how these protected areas and exclusive tourism zones need to be regulated. So, because it involves a lot of stakeholders, there are about 2 million jobs and about 4 million support jobs that all are dependent on Sundarbans. So, you talk about Bangladesh alone, there's about more than 4% of people are actually dependent on Sundarbans. So you can understand the stakes in this process. The next is the debate about the joint ownership. That means the dialogues between the countries, India and Bangladesh. And that's something is very important. And this is something that we probably need more a bullish approach and a sense of urgency. And we all have come out from the climate conference, as if the whole planet for the first time is so dependent on this climate conference. So where this the Sundarban in that climate conference? I've been trying to figure it out, you see. So here we talk about in this joint ownership, we have identified the 6 potential thrust areas. And this is again these Pence's and Mayer's where I picked up these areas, which primarily talk about measuring these tourism impacts, and also talk about identifying the roles of the development agency in terms of governance and their practices. And also important thing is about the inequitable power relations and the weak governance that can undermine certain efforts that government probably would make. And of course, the importance of the private sector business practices, which contribute towards poverty reductions. We know that how big corporates hijack with this. So finally, tourism benefits from the tourism do not percolate down to the people in the bottom of the pyramid. So, and also I mentioned about the multidisciplinary approach, which I said that why it has to be only interdisciplinary, it has to be kind of a silo effort. It has to be interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary, and also the need to now engage our research with practices on the ground. Okay, now I'm not too far from my coming to the conclusion, but one thing I probably would again like to come back is the economic livelihood, which is such an important part of this entire process. Is that please do underscore this point. Alone in Bangladesh, about 4% people are dependent on this for their economic survival. You can understand how important the debate of the poverty eradication is. And it certainly will have a bearing on sustainable tourism. So hence those trade-offs between sustainable tourism and poverty eradications, which most ugly form is a certain way it is politicized. So we exactly always fail to realize that what is that poverty eradication? What are the steps? Or is it merely a form of a populism? So we really need to understand that minus populism. Okay, so that on that basis, you arrange your trade-off with sustainable tourism. Okay, so this is something that I thought that we must discuss, and yeah, and then of course when you talk about the entire debate of Sundarban, we link it to the certain policy regime, we link it to regulatory mechanism and equity enhancing tourism, and this is an initiative. This is not only about Bangladesh, but India also is involved because it owns about 40% of that land mass. So here I discussed about the Daniel Skiller's model of looking into this, the way it now would be able to combine tourism in this continuum of poverty alleviation strategies within these antipodes of neoliberalism and protectionism. So now this, please try to understand the whole world is all about debate between protectionism and neoliberalism. And neoliberals have their lineage from those early days laissez-faire economy approach of the French. So that's something we really need to see. But the good point, which I would certainly like to read out, is that it's good for this debate, is that the neoliberal interpretations of the poverty eradications, and particularly in this context of the Sundarban discourse, actually fall well within this. So it tends to aggravate the poverty enhancing inequalities if allowed to operate in a free market environment. So here Skiller says that in order to be pro-poor, the growth must deliver disproportionate benefits to the poor to reduce the inequalities, which have been found to limit the potential for poverty alleviation. I think that's probably a good thing before I go into my conclusions. And my conclusion is that you have to really come back and start from where we started the debate or the trade-off between sustainable tourism and poverty eradications, the participations of the intergovernmental organizations, and then we see that how both nations can come into a discussions in terms of sharing responsibility to protect this fragile ecosystem and the diverse flora and fauna. One good thing is that I made a reference to the Cape Town declarations on the responsible tourism. I think that probably would serve as a template here in this case of Sundarban. And with that, I would say that it is extremely important before we all disappear. 2050 is a deadline. You're a huge part of your landmass you'll be losing due to the rise of the sea levels, greenhouse emissions, and the increasing human activity in that region.